Our sponsor today is Winty. Winty is an aviation-themed t-shirt business designing and printing aviation-related graphics for pilots, aviation businesses, and aviation enthusiasts worldwide. Using DTG direct-to-garment printing technology, Winty can print 1 or 100 plus garments upon request within a reasonably low turnaround time, including customer-submitted graphics. Contact Winty Aviation T-shirt Art by visiting winty.com today to find out how a custom aviation graphic can be printed for you. Hello everyone, good afternoon, and welcome to Savvy Central Radio. This is your host, Christina Nichman. Each week on Savvy, we host new individuals and business owners, inviting them to share their expertise, dreams, and lessons learned in their field of business. Our guest today is Jonathan J.J. Greenway. JJ is the former president of Avemco and chief pilot for AOPA, and is now a Capitol Hill advisor on Aviation Matters. JJ has flown over 14,000 hours since his teens. He was a corporate pilot in the South Pacific before becoming a Captain and Check Airman on the Boeing 767 for American Airlines. Later, he served as Director of Safety for the AOPA Air Safety Institute. An active CFI for over 30 years, JJ still shares his passion for aviation by flying and instructing in his Bellanca Decathlon. To reach JJ via email, you can contact him at jjgreenway@comcast.net. Hi, JJ. Thanks for coming back to Savvy Central Radio. How are you today?
I'm doing just fine on this rainy day, Christina.
Yeah, it is pouring down rain here in New York City this very day as well. But JJ, I'm so glad to have you back on Savvy for Aviation Month. This Aviation Series Month, we are going to have amazing people out from many different industries in the aviation business. And I'm excited to have you on because you've been in Avemco, which is the insurance company, one of the biggest for aviation. You've worked for AOPA, the biggest pilot organization for pilots in the United States. So I'd like if you could share your wisdom and expertise with us on what's going on with aviation today. To start, what would you say are some of the biggest concerns affecting general aviation today, or in aviation in total, actually?
Well, it's funny when we're talking about this today with the government shutdown. We've got some serious problems that just cropped up in the last couple of days.
Mm-hmm.
But hopefully this government shutdown isn't going to last for long. But moving on beyond that, of course, that's some things like the aircraft registration branch is affecting everyone from Boeing all the way down to light sport manufacturers. But general aviation is going through some tough times right now. And AOPA has really had their work cut out for them with fighting the battle on several different fronts. But government restriction and regulation, particularly with the Department of Homeland Security, is one big issue. Just the cost of general aviation is something that's really starting to cut into the overall activity.
Totally true. And I'm finding it a bit scary in all aspects of aviation. I'm hearing a lot of complaints online. Just this morning, one of my favorite airlines a long time ago that I used to fly with when I would go abroad was American Airlines. And someone just like totally poo-pooed them online, saying they lost their bags, they didn't give them good customer service. And then I'm hearing the same with all the other ones, from Delta to, all the other big legacy carriers. And I think what it is that they're overstressed, they're trying to cut costs, the bottom line, and what ends up hurting is customer service and trying to put the best possible aviation service out there for the public. And so it's hurting people's vision or their idea about aviation in general. And that's kind of scary for me because I don't want that in the future. We have less pilots or less people enthused about aviation because of this.
Yeah, the legacy carriers are they're not out of the woods yet. I mean, all the legacy carriers have declared bankruptcy at least once now, since American, of course, being the most recent. But I'll tell you what, there's some smaller carriers that are really giving the legacies a run for their money. Of course, Southwest, excellent reputation for customer service, Alaska Airlines as well, just to mention a few. The legacy carriers it's not a done deal. They're not necessarily here to stay. The most recent merger proposition between U.S. Airways and American has not been approved and might not get approved, and that could spell disaster for both those carriers if they're not allowed to merge and compete with the larger ones out there. But yeah, the customer service thing is a big thing with the airlines, but
Mhm.
and that does affect everyone's view of aviation all the way down to general aviation.
Yeah, as well as you mentioned Homeland Security. A lot of people I talk to are getting kind of scared off to even fly commercially because, oh, I have to go through checkpoints or, go through all the security systems. I just rather not fly at all. So that's one part of it. So now you don't want to get an airplane, even fly commercially. Well, then people have also been scared of small aircraft, general aviation, because they're like, oh, terrorist attacks, that could be very dangerous. I don't want to get a pilot license. So what would be your advice to try to work through some people's fear of aviation in general and general aviation?
Well, if you're following what AOPA has been working on with regard to the Department of Homeland Security's warrantless searches of general aviation aircraft, it's a big thing. I think there's been a total that they've documented of over 40.
Wow.
And compare it to driving down the road and being stopped and your car searched for no probable cause, no reason at all,
Hmm.
and not just a couple of minutes search, but maybe your car being completely taken apart. This has happened in general aviation. Last month, I had the rare opportunity of enough time to take a cross-country trip, literal cross-country trip
Hmm.
in my small airplane, a Decathlon, two-seat aerobatic airplane. Flew from the Washington, D.C. area where I live all the way up to Seattle and back. That was one thing I was concerned about. I did not encounter any trouble on my own,
Hmm.
but I had talked to several aviators that have been stopped and searched. And obviously, the Department of Homeland Security was created to combat terrorism, but
Hmm.
in all the searches that AOPA has documented, it didn't seem like they were looking for terrorists. No one really knows what they were looking for, and the DHS stands by their stance where they reserve the right to do this. AOPA has not been successful in getting them to stop. So it's out there, it's going on, but like I say, I was worried about it, but there isn't anything we can do. Obviously, we have to cooperate if we're stopped by
Hmm.
the authorities that are heavily armed. So
Yeah.
not much we can do, but it is, AOPA is working on that on a daily basis.
Well, it's a good thing to bring it to the audience's attention because I tell you, JJ, I've noticed that we are being stopped more by our cars in New York City. Now, I know New York's the hub. It's like the capital. If we were going to maybe have another attack, it might be in New York City, being one of the biggest cities in the United States. But we are starting to have checkpoints in our cars within the 5 boroughs of New York City. And it's a little scary because they don't they're not as extensive as they are in general aviation where they strip your whole plane and take everything out, but they do detain you for a while and they don't tell you what the heck they're detaining you for.
Yeah, that's the problem, and I've flown general aviation aircraft literally around the world on
Mhm.
most of the continents, and that used to be a concern in third world countries
Mhm.
that the authorities would take your airplane apart looking for presumably drugs or cash or something like that.
Mhm.
It's sad that in the last couple of years that's become not the norm in this country, but it's becoming almost commonplace.
Mm.
Not a good feeling.
No, no, and it's almost like the fear that people feel for terrorism. That's exactly the power that terrorists have over anyone is the use of fear. It's really not so much the attack that they do because sometimes the attack doesn't affect that many people. It depends on what type of attack they do, but it's what they leave behind, the fear that they leave behind in the mind of the people.
And that's kind of what's gripping us now. But
Hmm.
it doesn't paint a good picture of general aviation. But one thing that we can't do a whole lot about, other than maybe make sure that our elected officials know what's going on. Of
Yeah.
course, if it starts happening to our elected officials as well, maybe we will see some action on that. I want to dwell on some of the things that we can do things about. And the cost of general aviation right now is probably the biggest prohibitive factor.
Hmm.
You remember a couple of years, well, not a couple of years ago, but when the concept of the light sport aircraft came on the market, and
Hmm.
there were some rosy predictions that probably were dampened by economic downturn.
Yeah.
Fact of the matter is, though, Christina, it's just even the light sport aircraft that have been manufactured, prices are well into the six figures now.
Yes.
And that just doesn't fly for the average person on the average income to get into aviation. But I think that working together, some of the alphabet groups can put the pressure on the manufacturer to build a cheaper airplane. Maybe light sport's not the answer. For the price of a 25, 30-year-old Cessna 150 can be refurbished
Hmm.
in excellent condition, made into excellent condition for a fraction of the price of a brand new light sport aircraft. And we see a lot of that going on. My Decathlon has been in 1977 has been completely refurbished, and I have a fraction of the price or a fraction of the money in it that I would have if I purchased a brand new light sport. So I see a lot of people doing that. But I guess one thing that bothers me is the complexity that manufacturers are building into airplanes is not really necessary. It's like your smartphone. It's got way more features on it than you'll ever use and more tech savvy than I am, but mine's got so many features on it that I don't know how to use that I need some technical help to be using them. And general aviation aircraft have gotten to be the same thing, unfortunately.
What it's become, I think, and it's our whole society, is it's become gadget crazed. It's like, oh, let me get the new smartphone that has a billion and one things. My friend came to me last week. She got a new smartphone, $800. And why she got it is because it gives you a little pen and a pad where you can actually draw on the screen like you're drawing a picture. So now she can have a sketchbook wherever she goes. I'm like, and how many times have you used it since you bought it a month ago? Well, once. So it's really interesting how our society has kind of become a little tech crazed or gadget crazed. And the same thing, as you mentioned, is happening in aviation as the aviation manufacturers come up with these new systems like glass cockpits, which are all computerized and such, with a million different things that you can do in it. You can see weather, you can see traffic. I mean, I have to tell you, JJ, I was a little disconcerted when I was flying about 2 months ago with my friend, and air traffic control said to a pilot, there's traffic, 10 o'clock, Cessna, do you see it? And he was just like, oh, no, don't see it on my system, meaning, he said TCAS, but his plane wouldn't actually have a TCAS. But he said, oh, no, I'm not seeing it on my computer screen. I'm like, you're in an airplane. It's VFR, which means, you can look out the window and see if there's traffic. But people are relying so much on their gadgets, they're not paying attention to what's actually right in front of them.
Well, that is a huge problem, Christina, and it's a safety problem is what it is. And when the so-called technologically advanced aircraft started coming out a little more than a decade ago, there's so many features that a lot of us that were concerned about safety thought, hey, this is going to make aviation safer.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you look at the statistics, and it really hasn't. I mean, ballistic recovery system, the parachute on an aircraft like the Cirrus, yeah, that may have made it safer, but overall, the airplane does not have all that good of a safety record, and some of the insurers are shying away from insuring them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the training approach is what suffers. And the reason why I say that, the latest produced airliners, the 777, the 787, the new 747-800 that Boeing is building, those have as much gadgetry on them, if you want to call it that, as the new general aviation aircraft. However, they are very safe airplanes because the pilots are trained to use all the equipment.
Mm-hmm.
One of the problems I see now as a very active flight instructor is in a very complex and sophisticated panel,
Mm-hmm.
I can spend more time teaching them to use the electronics, the avionics, the computers than I am teaching them to actual stick and rudder skills of flying the airplane.
Yeah, I totally see where you're coming from there. I actually love the Cirrus aircraft for what it is. I think it has a beautiful, slick airframe that makes it flow through the air very nicely. It feels really nice when you fly it. Again, though, the avionics and the computer electronics in it are really complicated, and I find myself overwhelmed by it. Now, I'm not the actual pilot of it. When I go flying with my friend, he has been rated to fly it and, checked out in it. But I can see that if you are a beginner student or anywhere in the beginning stages, I don't think you should be touching an aircraft like a Cirrus. It's just way too complex.
Yeah, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
It's the distraction factor, too, of there's so much going on. And once again, I'm not knocking the technology. It's great technology, but I think in training, we have to approach it. Let's learn the stick and rudder. Let's learn to fly the airplane first and learn what it feels like before we start delving into the rest of it. But another thing, too, is how quickly outdated some of these things are. And the manufacturers are stopping their support of products that are just 5, 6, 7 years old, which is almost unheard of, forcing the owners, aircraft owners, to update their equipment at great cost.
Mm-hmm.
A fellow that I rent a hangar to here in Frederick, Maryland, came to me the other day and was telling me about a particular avionics suite in his airplane that will no longer be supported. And he said, I guess I'm going to have to shell out $66,000 for a new panel for the airplane. Well, he's fairly wealthy and he can afford to do that. But when he walked away, the other three of us who were sitting there thought, hey, if we take all of our airplanes together and add them up, it doesn't even come to $66,000. So that is a cost that very few people can afford. And the manufacturers are beginning to see that if they do things like that, avionics manufacturers, it is going to cut into their sales.
And I like that point you're mentioning, JJ, is because I think a lot of companies kind of focus at first really on the bottom line. What can we do to make as much money max and not worry about the future? Because a lot of companies out there are like, let's make this a product for today, throw away a couple years, they have to come back to us and get another one. And that's very much so with the computer system. Before you even get your computer in the door in your house after you buy it, it's already obsolete practically. It's insane.
Yeah.
So, and I think they're doing that with the aircraft computerization in the cockpit. They're trying to like, okay, let's have this, for a couple of years, we'll give them a brand new spanking new one, tell them about how many amazing features are on it, and now you have to get this one because we're not going to support the other one. But like you said, it's going to hurt their bottom line in the long run because now people can't afford to go get the new panel. So, hey, now I can't fly anymore. So now what have you gained?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I started learning to fly in 1976 is when I took my first lesson.
Mm-hmm.
When you went to rent an aircraft, you could rent, typically most of the FBOs that rented or flight schools that rented airplanes had a VFR and an IFR airplane.
Mm-hmm.
The VFR just had a communication navigation radio maybe and a transponder. The IFR one, of course, was equipped for instrument flying. The VFR one was a lot cheaper, number one. They tended to be a lot more reliable because there was fewer things to break down. And I don't see that in aviation today.
Mm-hmm.
Our local flight school here in Frederick, Maryland, rents fairly late model Cessna 172s that are fully equipped for IFR flying.
Mm-hmm.
Great if you're working on your instrument rating and want to do some IFR flying, but that's basically the only airplane that's available for primary training. And that is a problem on a couple of fronts. First off, it's very expensive because the hull value of these airplanes is approaching $300,000.
Mm-hmm.
To ensure that for student flying is very expensive because of the large hull value. And then once again, with the training, it's not simple. You don't have a student soloing in 6 to 8 to 10 hours like you did 20 or 30 years ago
mm-hmm.
because you're spending more time teaching the aircraft systems that are there.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think that's cut into general aviation being available to everyone these days. Another thing too is, and we touched on it before, Christina, is distraction in the cockpit.
Mm-hmm.
There's too much information out there.
Yeah.
And proponents of it may argue with me and say, hey, it's great that I can punch up on the panel, I can find out what fuel prices are in Laramie, Wyoming. Yeah, that's great, but is that something you should be fooling with in flight?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a great fan of epic music. I was flying the Garmin G1000 system in a Diamond DA40 that was had the satellite link up, and I was pleased that I could listen to Bob Dylan on a cross-country flight. Well, that was great, but it took me a while to page through all the different pages on the G1000 and finally find the in-flight music. Good, but not necessary for the flying. It could have been, had I been a new pilot and had to spend more time looking for it, I could really cut it. You were talking about traffic calls. We need to be spending more time looking out the window
mm-hmm.
than we do looking at the panel. And there's just so much more heads down time that we spend. And, the airlines went through a thing with that when we came to the glass cockpit with mm-hmm. the advent of the 757, 767 in the 80s. Pilots were spending too much heads down time. There was an incidence, a rise in the occurrence of runway incursions because pilots were not paying attention. And it didn't take long before airline procedure individually with the airlines changed so that they would not program flight management systems while they're taxiing, mm-hmm. Or one person always had to be heads up when the other one was heads down. They had to announce. One pilot had to announce to the other, I'm going inside, something to that effect. Mm-hmm. And that kind of discipline really needs to be instilled in us general aviation pilots, just so we don't spend too much time looking inside when we should be looking outside.
I completely agree, JJ. And going back to what you were saying about the schools and having very little options other than maybe a very complex or difficult aircraft for their students to use, maybe some 7 odd years ago when I was first looking for a flight school to train at, I went to Islip and I went to a school there that offered me a flight lesson. And they said, we're going to take you up. And I said, are you sure? It's kind of looking yucky out there. And they said, no, it's great. We'll take you somewhere to a practice area or we can fly you out to Pennsylvania. In a plane you can go pretty fast, so we'll take you out somewhere nice and we'll do our practice there. And so I said, okay, you're the experts. So I got into this aircraft. I knew nothing about it, and we barely had taken off when we're in the soup already. We're inside the massive clouds. I see nothing, and I start to freak out. It's my first flight. I can't see anything out the window. The plane's bouncing around. I just totally want to freak out. Fly around the pattern and come back down, and they charged me $123. So sad. But here's the other thing that I learned now later on looking at my flight log book is that the plane they put me in was a complex aircraft. It was a 172S model, I think,
Uh,
and it had a retractable gear and constant speed propeller. And I'm thinking, brand new, spanking new student coming for his first flight, and you're going to put him in that aircraft?
yeah,
Very sad.
I question the wisdom of that.
But see, that could also harm someone and totally get them going the opposite direction, never wanting to take a flight class again. So I would say to flight schools out there, we want to get the general population of pilots up, because in a couple of years, especially when the airlines start letting go anyone who's over 65, because they have that rule in place, we're over 65, you can't fly for the airlines anymore. We're going to have a big insurgence of pilots we're going to need to start flying commercial, to be commercial pilots. And we need those pilots. So we can't have people being scared off from prices being too high, to schools trying to get as much money as possible from the student today, and manufacturers overcharging for complex systems. I mean, everyone in aviation has got to find a way to bring down the cost.
Well, that's right. And we're not just going to need pilots. We're going to need pilots with a good background in stick and rudder. And that's one of my concerns. And not pointing to any one particular accident, and not to oversimplify, but there have been a couple airline accidents where there was a sad, recently, where there was a sad lack of just basic stick and rudder abilities. You probably read Richard Bach, but in one of his book of short stories, I think it was A Gift of Wings was the book, but he has a chapter in there where he reminisces about what it would be like to have this utopian flight school where the students learn in an airplane that basically just has oil pressure, altimeter, and airspeed. And I think what a great idea to do that. And I often talk with some of my fellow flight instructor friends about, hey, let's buy a couple hundred acres up in Pennsylvania and use basic airplanes, fly off grass, and teach people learn to fly without even talking on the radio at first, because it doesn't take a radio to fly an airplane. Maybe there is a flight school out there I just don't know about, but that's the idea. That's how you make pilots. Basic skills first, and then add the other things on there. I sometimes joke with my friends when we're talking about this that the Wright brothers came along in 1903. Marconi built airborne radio in 1929 or so. So we had 26 relatively good years of aviation where airplanes didn't have radios, but yet they still flew. It's a point to think about, though, of all the distractions in flight training. Just when you talk to people that have soloed, we tend to solo students in less amount of time at a non-towered airport. So we're taking valuable time that costs hundreds of dollars per hour in flight training fees to teach them how to talk on the radio.
Yeah, I would say to be smart about it, and I have to tell you, it's so weird. I do Savvy Central Radio twice a week. You get me on the radio in a cockpit, and I get really, really scared to talk to ATC, especially in the New York City area and near Class Bravo or anything like that. And I always generally use Republic Airport. So, and even at Republic Airport, sometimes the air traffic controllers are a bit harsh because they're overwhelmed. There's a lot of traffic. But you get anywhere near New York Approach or something, and I'm just like, I'm just scared to get on the radio. They're really, really they talk fast. They have no patience. But I understand why. The traffic is insane. So, I mean, I think Republic, if you want to learn to fly in different areas, especially airspace that's really congested, it can be helpful, because then if you're just learning at a non-towered airport and then you go to a place like Republic in New York City or in Long Island, you will be completely overwhelmed. You probably won't be able to handle it.
Oh, yeah. Well, a little tip here from an old guy that's been flying airplanes in a lot of places. Website, liveatc.net, I believe it is. You can tune in and listen live to ATC at a lot of different airports in the country and around the world. I use that a lot when I'm flying someplace where I'd never been before. I'll tune in and listen to the chatter just to get a feel for it. And for new pilots, that can be very, very valuable. Just have that playing in the background at home on a rainy day like this, and you really get a feel for how the controllers are going to talk to you when you get there.
Yeah, I completely agree. I use them a lot, and at work I have them playing in the background. But there's this other system, and I can't quite, Pilot Edge, is that what it's called, JJ, where you can get on and practice with people who are actually doing the role of an air traffic controller, and you talk to them as you fly a simulator?
Yeah, I have a student that did that extensively, and it helped his radio skills for the IFR. I think the last time I saw you when we flew, I forgot the airport was that we flew into last April for that event, but I had gotten on Live ATC just to get a feel for the operations at that airport. And I've been doing this for several decades, but it helped me and gave me an edge when I flew in there, just to hear things like what kind of reporting points would the tower ask you to report over, or which runway, when they're using runways that intersect, which runway would they tend to give a general aviation aircraft versus a business jet or something. So yeah, you fly into a place like Teterboro, and it's really necessary where it's so busy like that, really necessary that you are at least knowing what the controller is going to say as far as reporting points.
That's fabulous. Yeah, it's really fabulous advice and very good. And what I like about it, and you were talking about this before, sterile cockpit, to, really keep it business while you're flying in the cockpit. Because, people can be distracted with playing with their iPad. Oh, here's another one. The GoPro cameras. Yeah, it's cool that you can tape your flight in progress, but people are playing around the cockpit doing a whole bunch of stuff, listening to music, setting up video cams, and you're not flying the airplane. You're not paying attention to what's going on in flight. And what we often do, me and my friend who go flying, is we turn on the radio and we're listening to the weather ahead of us in the direction we're going to. Not only listening to we'll also turn on the ATISes on the airports coming up. We're always thinking, okay, if the engine were to quit in the next couple minutes, where will we land? So we're looking at the map, paying attention to different airports around us, just keeping aware, because, hey, you could be playing with your GoPro camera and bam, the engine goes off. Oh, where am I? I have no idea.
There's a disturbing number of videos out there on YouTube where the GoPro camera has caught something like that happening and recorded it all the way to the ground then. But no, I as an aside, I had an FAA inspector say to me a couple months ago, he said, enforcement action has gotten much easier since the advent of the GoPro camera.
Oh my gosh, it helps them a lot. Wow.
So people are doing some things that they shouldn't be doing and recording it too. So.
Yeah. And here's the most disturbing video, JJ, I've ever seen. It was two people in a cockpit, and they were flying in a canyon. I think it was by what's that big canyon in the middle of the United States that everyone goes to? Super huge.
Not the Grand Canyon.
No, it couldn't be. Okay, there was mountains. Okay, I gotta look it up again. But they were flying through some canyons, and it looked absolutely gorgeous in their GoPro camera that they had set up. And he's talking and telling his passenger about all the wonderful sights. And then all of a sudden, because I'm watching the video, I start to notice the ground is getting closer and closer. And they're talking and talking. I'm like, oh my gosh, they're getting closer and closer to the mountain below them. And what it is when you fly as well is that the ground doesn't stay level. As you transverse through different states and different areas, sometimes the ground rises. So you have to pay attention to where you are in the proximity to the ground, and they weren't. And then sadly, as they kept going, it wasn't until they were just about to hit the end of the canyon that I guess he noticed, oh my God, I'm too low. He tried to bank and turn, and he couldn't. And then his last words, I'm sorry, Charlie, and bam, they were dead.
Yeah, wow.
And they videoed the whole thing. I mean, somehow they found the video and they recorded it, and they kind of put it up there as a cautionary tale to pilots that pay attention to your flying first. Don't pay attention to the video and the sights. And it can be hard when you're seeing amazing visuals outside, but if you're the pilot, concentrate on the flying, and next time another leg, someone else flies, and you pay attention to the visuals. But yeah, that was a very sad story.
I think what we need to do as pilots is recognize, since the manufacturers aren't doing it for us, and since the training syllabus often is lacking in this regard, recognize what can help you and what can hurt you. That's the big thing. The terrain displays with terrain warning. Excellent tool for finding out, like you were saying, the terrain gets higher and higher and higher further west you go from here. But learn how to use that and use it correctly. There was an accident that occurred in 2005 up the Columbia River Gorge where they figured out the pilot was actually using his terrain display to fly down in the Columbia River Gorge, and met with some very sad results and resultant fatalities. Not the proper use of terrain displays on the airplane, but the proper use would be find out, with the green terrain being lower, the yellow higher, and red, of course, something that you're going to hit. Find out exactly how to use that and use that to your advantage. Like I say, technology is not bad, just the misuse of technology. When I was on this trip out west, of course, my airplanes, it's just 150 horsepower. It's not high performance by any means, and that was the whole point of my trip, was to see the country. But I stopped and saw, but just before I crossed the Cascade Mountains, which are not as big as the Rockies, but Cascades are challenging to fly across in bad weather. But just before I crossed the Cascades, I stopped on the east side of the mountains and met with an old flight instructor of mine. I'd flown with him 30 some odd years ago, he gave me my first complex checkout in a Mooney 201, the M20J.
Hmm.
And he said, you're flying across the pass, across Snoqualmie Pass to Seattle. He said, have you gotten on the website and looked at the cameras, the webcams that they have set up?
Mm.
I said, no, I had no idea. And he directed me to the site, and we sat down in his house, and they had webcams for all the major passes across the Cascades. Well, come to find out that, of course, they've been doing that in Alaska for years, and there's the same thing across many passes in mountainous terrain.
Mhm.
And that's great technology because in real time, I could look and I could see if the passes were open for VFR flying or if there was clouds up there. And obviously, I didn't have that in the cockpit for real time, but before I took off and was up there 20 minutes later, it was a great tool to do. And I'm using that now in my flight instruction. I've gone out there and I didn't realize it before. I'm glad he showed it to me, but I show my students that they can go out there and see a webcam at a particular airport or something just to get an idea of what the weather's like.
That's a really, really great idea. I was just thinking about another thing that came to my attention and kind of shocked me is complacency. And we've heard that in aviation, complacency kills. And the thing that bothers me about some of these complex or all these electronics and things we have at our advantage, all this extra information, is that I think it's caused people to be a bit more complacent because now they're like, I can just check my computer in the cockpit. I don't need to do a weather briefing before I take off or something like that. Or in the case maybe of these two people who are going flying in the canyon, they're like, hey, we're cool. We'll use our electronic systems in the computer to figure out how far we are off from the ground. But sadly, they should do their homework with maps and discovering that the place they're going to transverse, what is the land like? What do I have to pay attention to? Not just jump in the airplane and expect our systems to kind of take care of the flight.
Well, that is a problem, the complacency factor. When you press that little D with the arrow on it, direct to your destination or direct to wherever you're going, and that nice, pretty magenta line lights up on your screen, that's real easy and that's real nice. But do you know exactly what you're flying over?
Hmm.
Aside from the safety standpoint, I've talked to a couple of pilots, particularly here in the Washington, D.C. area, that they pressed direct and that pretty magenta line took them right through prohibited or restricted airspace.
Wow.
Once you're met with that Customs and Border Patrol helicopter coming up alongside you and wanting to talk to you on 121.5, the emergency frequency, you find out real quick that that's not a good idea to fly direct through prohibited or restricted airspace. But it's just so easy to do with the technology in the cockpit that a lot of us get lured into it. We press direct and we are so complacent we don't pull out a map and see what we're going over when we're going direct.
Mhm. Or get possible NOTAMs or TFRs, find out what's going on in the area from Flight Briefer to find out, okay, in this area you have to be careful because they've shut it down for VIP or whatever the case might be.
That's exactly right. Tell a quick story on myself. I get a weather briefing every time I take a cross-country trip. But flying up to a destination closer to you, I got the weather briefing to go into Ocean City, New Jersey. 26 November is the identifier.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, I saved the briefing. I got it online through Duet. I saved the briefing, and you know how long those briefings are. You get a briefing for a short flight like that. If you were to print it out, it'd be 30 or 40 pages.
Yeah.
And they might tell you about a laser light show that's going on in New York City, even though it's not near your destination. We talk about TMI, way too much information in some of these briefings.
Mm.
So I got the briefing for the trip. It was at 110 miles or so from here to out to Ocean City, New Jersey, and beautiful weather. I thought I read through the whole briefing. I got out there, and as I circled overhead, I didn't hear anybody on Unicom, so I thought, well, I'll circle overhead and look at the windsock. There were big X's painted on the runway, and that means the airport's closed.
Yeah. And we've had that happen too. We've gotten a flight briefing and they didn't warn us about things they should have, but warned us about a billion other things that we didn't need to know about.
Exactly, and that was the case here. So when I had plenty of fuel, I turned around, came back home, and I thought that I was kind of embarrassed. I didn't tell anybody about it at first. But I looked through the briefing, and it was about 75 pages. I printed it just for fun. It was about 75 pages. I have it right here. On page 38, there was a little notation that said 26 November.
Mm-hmm.
That's the identifier for the airport. It said AD,
Mm-hmm.
and then it said CLSD. So 26 November, AD, CLSD. Well, AD is aerodrome in NOTAM technology, and CLSD is closed. So basically on page 38 of the 75-page briefing, it said Ocean City Airport's closed in a little notation. And I thought, wow, that was easy to miss. And it made me wonder what else I miss when I get briefings sometimes. So yes, it was my fault. If something had happened, the FAA or NTSB, what have you, would come back to me and say I didn't read the briefing. and I didn't read the briefing adequately. But the information is not being presented in the best way possible. I will say, though, that in the last couple of years, both Duets and Duat, the providers of online briefings, are making it a little better so that the pertinent information comes up first on the briefing, on the continuous briefing. But you're right. You tend to get, if you get a live briefing, the briefer will tell you about some things that really don't matter and may skip over something that could be critical.
Yeah, yeah. And like you said, you are right. If something were to happen, even if you're going into restricted airspace, then the FAA will pull you over and say, hey, it was your fault. You're the pilot in command. You're the one who has to know this information. It's not anyone else's responsibility to make sure you know. And I'm like, but seriously, people, there's so much information out there. But that's another thing that comes to mind, JJ, is that the briefers are awesome. All the briefers I've come across are really, really helpful. But they're also just reading off a screen and clicking from one tab to another, just giving you the information on the screen.
Yeah.
And so sometimes you have to pinpoint and say, okay, here's the information I need. Can you clarify this or that? And ask them, know like what's your path going to be, and ask them questions when they're done. And they're usually very, very helpful.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And there are some things that our legal system requires them to tell us. And so if they're giving us what seems like extraneous information, they're just doing that to cover a base, I'm sure. But I think as pilots, aviation is one of the last things where you can't shift the blame. The pilot in command is responsible. And so many other things, we blame automobile manufacturers, we blame highway departments, we blame a lot of other people. But in aviation, the buck does stop with the pilot. When something goes wrong, more often than not, chain leads back to the pilot.
Yeah, absolutely. So it behooves us all to really get more educated and continue to keep learning. Once you've got your license, whatever, got your private pilot license, you've got your instrument rating, it never stops. It's a continual learning process because aviation is continually changing and growing.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, JJ, it's been awesome having you on Savvy Central Radio today. Is there any last words you'd like to leave our audience with?
Well, I'll echo what you said, Christina. Never quit learning, and get out there and present the good side of aviation, of general aviation. Be a good example for pilots that are thinking about getting into it more, or non-pilots that want to start learning to fly. Take somebody for a ride. I try to take all my local politicians for a ride, and most of them are amazed when they get up there that how much fun it is and how much freedom there is.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, JJ, for coming out here and sharing your wisdom on this very important topic.
Thank you, Christina, and hopefully it'll stop raining here pretty quick and we can both go flying.
Yay!
Take
care, JJ. Have an awesome day. Tune in this Monday, November 4th at 1 p.m. Eastern for our second episode in this Aviation Month, where our guest will be Abingdon Chelsea Welch on Thinking Outside the Box. Abingdon is the founder and owner of the Abingdon Company, which specializes in travel timepieces and jewelry for women in aviation. Savvy Central Radio is proud to host our 4th symposium. Join us in our new multi-part speaking series called Mastering the Influence Game, starting this fall in New York City. Every 2 months for the next several months, we'll be bringing you global cutting-edge experts in the field of influence, marketing, and media, designed to give entrepreneurs and small business owners the tools and strategies to take their business to the next level. To register and book your tickets today, go to masteringtheinfluencegame.eventbrite.com.